In this video, we will talk about residential, commercial, and industrial zones. In particular, this video is going to cover populations of each one of those zones and how that will affect your building. There will be a second video concerning these zones where we will dive into the mechanics more and how they function. But for this video, we're just going to deal with the numbers. You will see in the background, I have my city pulled up again. And the reason I have my city pulled up is for some visual cues. What I'm also going to be pulling up is this picture here. And what this picture provides is the population of residential, commercial, and industrial zones for each stage. For example, an R0 is when the individual houses are forming. Each house is 20 each. Then it will go up a level and another level and so forth. It can go all the way to an R top. Same rules apply for a commercial zone and an industrial zone, except these don't start as houses. Now, rather than memorize this table, what you can do is remember that every step, it goes up by 160 residents. This is even true when talking about tops. An R top has a population of 1,920. If you divide that by 2, which is talking about half a top, it will have a population of 960. I have a paragraph down here discussing this. The difference between half a top having a population of 960 and the stage before it, 800, the difference between those is 160. So even when we go to the R top, the same rules apply. In an R top's case, each half of the zone has 160 added to it. And then those two zones are combined together into one population, and that's how you get the population of an R top. Looking in my city again, you will notice different kinds of residential zones. This is an R high. This is an R upper. And this is an R mid. You can even use this magnifying glass to see this. This is a C high. And above it is a C upper. Now, despite looking significantly different aesthetics-wise, all three of these residential zones, which are fully developed, by the way, this high, upper, mid, have the same population in them, which is 800. So this mid has 800, this high has 800, and this upper has 800. So when looking at these values, each step doesn't correspond to the different kinds of residential zones. It corresponds to the different levels as they are developing. This is also true for commercial zones as well. This C high has a population of 800, and this C upper has a population of 800 as well. There are also I highs and I lows. This I high has a population of 640. This I low has a population of 640. They share the same population. So aside from aesthetics, is there any difference between these three zones as far as building? Well, in order to get an R top, you would need to get two R highs adjacent to each other. These two R mids will never become an R top because they're not R highs. While I can't 100% confirm this next difference, I'm pretty sure that even though they have the same population, the amount of income you get from them at the end of the year is different. So having a lot of R highs will bring in more income than if you have R mids. This doesn't really matter though, since if we're doing the money cheat, we're going to set taxes to 0% anyway. So then that doesn't matter at all. Other than those things, there is really no difference between them. They developed into different kinds of residential zones based off the land values. Now, I will say that R mids, which you can see in this one too, while they do have the same population fully developed, they can fluctuate. We're going to hold off on why that's the case until we talk about land value, but just something to keep in mind. Uppers and highs will not fluctuate provided that they have correct transportation. Lows can fluctuate as well. There are no lows in this city for me to show you, though. Now let's go ahead and take a look at this again. And what I really want you to pay attention to now is the industrial zones. When comparing residential, commercial, and industrial zones will cap out at 640 residents when fully developed. Whereas residential and commercial zones will cap out at 800 if they're just individual zones, or 960 per half a top if you get C and R tops. So what does that mean? That means that as long as you can get a fully developed residential or commercial zone, they will have more population in them than an industrial zone. If we go to my total screen again, this is why I only have 55 industrial zones. It's because residential and commercial zones, when fully developed, will hold more population. Back in the day, we would build over 300 industrial zones, thinking we needed them. But in reality, you don't. You don't need that many at all. And in fact, you don't need any industrial zones when building a city. However, when you're building on a non-island map, while you don't have to necessarily build any industrial zones at all, it's not realistic to do that. There's going to be a lot of places where we're not going to get zones to develop. And so instead of just putting partially developed commercial zones or residential zones that won't develop in certain spots, we replace them with industrial zones. And that kind of answers the first big question. When do you put industrial zones down? You put industrial zones down where residential and commercial zones don't develop. When I was building this city, I was doing my best to try and make all of these commercial zones. I was trying my best to make all of this bottom left commercial zones. But notice that they're not all commercial zones. There are industrial zones just kind of randomly put with them. This is because these are the spots I could not get a fully developed commercial zone or a residential zone. And so you use industrial zones as filler, essentially, when you're building. You put them in the spots where you can't get those zones to develop. If you play on an island map, there are no corners or edges with land. You can actually build a city without having any industrial zones. I have done this myself, so I know it's possible. There's no particular reason why I have 55 industrial zones in this city. In general, I was trying to get the least amount as possible. One last thing I'd like to show you before we wrap this first part up is this table again. And when you look at this table, okay, there does come a point where commercial and residential zones have the same population as an industrial zone. When comparing the second highest level commercial zone with a fully developed industrial zone, you will notice that they have the same population. They are tied. And so one thing you might think is, well, if I can get my commercial zones to the second highest level, then I could just leave those and not build any industrial zones anyway. Well, the reality is, when you get really high populations, the most difficult thing to do when building is maintaining commercial demands. Let me open up the map for you and show you just how many commercial zones I have. Having this many commercial zones is extremely difficult. And in fact, from the beginning of the build all the way to the very end, I am fighting every second, every step of the building process to keep commercial demand high. And how do you keep commercial demand high? You have to compensate it by building more residential zones. When I get a commercial zone to the second highest level, it's not a good idea to keep it that way just because it has the same population as a fully developed industrial zone. Yes, it doesn't emit any pollution, which is nice, I suppose, but you're just going to make it even more difficult for you to keep the demand up when building, at least at this level. If you're building very casually, you may not notice commercial demand drop really at all. But at these levels where you're packing in as much population as possible, always replace commercial zones that are at the second highest level with industrial zones. The only time you may not necessarily do that is if you have commercial zones that are really, really close to a residential area. For example, if this zone right here were a C3 upper, I believe. Yeah, C4 upper. A C4 upper, which is the second highest level. I don't want to replace it with an industrial zone because the pollution the industrial zone will emit will make, or most likely make, all of these residential zones around it fluctuate. And it would actually kill off this residential top. So that's a really niche situation on when you wouldn't. But if it's always there on the edges and corners, you absolutely want to replace those partially developed commercial zones with industrial zones for the sake of helping yourself out with the demand bar, the RCI meter. Remember, they have the same population, so it doesn't matter that you're going to replace one with the other. You won't lose population in the long run. So that wraps up populations. Doesn't seem like much, seems pretty straightforward. However, as we keep progressing through these videos, they will start getting a bit more technical and will stack upon each other. So just make sure you understand the basic ideas that I talked about here before watching the next one.